Hi, welcome to In the Fire Garden, episode 3, the second recording here. I'm here with today's guest, who I'm very excited to be with, Hussain Ahmed, the author of his debut poetry collection, Soliloquy with Ghost in Nile, from Black Ocean Press. About Hussain Ahmed is a Nigerian poet and environmentalist. He holds an MFA in poetry from the University of Mississippi and a current PhD student at the University of Cincinnati. His poems are featured in Agni, Poetry Magazine, the Kenyan Review, A Public Space, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. He is a winner of the 2022 Orson Prize Poetry 2022 finalist for the University of Wisconsin Press's Brittingham Prize and Felix Pollock Prize poetry competition, the 2021 semifinalist Cave Canem Poetry Prize, and several others. He's the author of the chapbook Harp in a Fireplace from Newfound Press in 2021, and his debut collection Soliloquy with Ghost in Nile was out 2022 with Black Ocean Press. He is currently an editorial assistant for Seneca Review and the Cincinnati Review. So, Hussain, thank you for being here, and that's a wonderful resume. You can find him basically in every big hitter publication there is, and we can see why. This is a major book.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Shane. It's a real pleasure to have be able to come read or talk about my book to someone. And as someone who's as a student of poetry myself, I can have the whenever I have the pleasure of speaking to someone, even if it's just like a single person about the book, I'm very, very much excited about it, And every time I hold the book, can remind me of the inspiration that goes into the start of the book. And I would like to say earlier in a few years back, I started writing these poems that made this book in Kakuri, which is like a place where I was born in Kaduna in Nigeria. And I like to write at night, so there are times when I just sit down, obviously had nothing to write about. All I do is on my TV and I switch to BBC or the CNN to just see what's going on around the world. And then in that silent space that I have in my room, I then find connections with what I have experienced, what I'm experiencing, with what is going on around the world. All right. And the first poem that I always like to read, for some reason, I don't know why, is the second poem in the book titled Flight. And so it's a poem that was inspired by the plane crash that happened, I think, with this Ethiopian airline some years back. And we had a professor, Pius Adesomi, who's a Nigerian scholar, a literary scholar who was part of the victim of that plane crash. And this is is from a series of poems I wrote about that incident, and this is titled Flight. The day an airplane crashed, the air became heavy with the aura of mouth, sore with grieving songs. I was taught to plead with the fire in my broken tongue, as would an owl tired of nocturne. Today, we celebrate everyone that died in flight, everyone who had a name similar to ours. I felt all our dead reincarnated in me today. My body is now soundproof. I do not recognize the songs that slip out of my mouth. How the War Made Us a Name is a poem that I wrote about the series of religious crises that happened in Kaduna, Nigeria during the new millennium. And not just this poem, I think several of the poems in this book made reference to the new millennium in the year 2000 and the series of events that can shape my memory of childhood. This is called How the War Made Us a Name. Before the war, we had names we inherited from the dead. They keep us warm until we start to lose those names to the wind. The long corridors in my throat are of tinted glass windows. All that happened belongs in the darkness of what may wash off the memories of all the dead. I wake up with scars on my arms and it surprises me that I still feel dead after gulping a cup of pap. I feel strange in my father's rug too, even though it keeps me warm. I need all the heat I can get today so the eggs in my body can hatch and be set free to make nests far from here, where they would not be haunted to deliver obituaries in envelopes that are large enough to be registers, wherein our names are written. For each condolence visit, the war made us names too much to keep up with. We learn to escape the burning before we learn that every name we inherit comes with allergies. I threw a harp inside the fireplace and it poured out the tunes I once heard Baba played on it. It stopped when it got swallowed in the flames. All we inherited still burned. Reverse concert. Um, I do not know why. The times when I title my poems, necessarily not because I have like a reason for it. I just feel like it made sense. And this is like one of those poems where I feel like the first word in the poem is sing, and then the last one is also sing. And that poem and the one before it, which is the aperture diameter, kind of like chronicle, kind of like a reversing scenes where like I go from past and then I come back to present and past to present. That spiral mode is what I'm trying to do in this poem. And for some reason, I named this reverse concert, which is like the first poem that gave birth to the idea of like having to write in spirals. Sing. Sing of the pyramid of ruins that is left of home. Before the fire, this house was an aquarium, transparent only from inside. We are surrounded by walls of brown paper that are also maps of countries we visit in sleep. The degrees inside the room coincide with the weather outside. All my aunties are in matching gowns, patterned like the flowers in the vase. About home I sing, without telling of what whispers I heard in the wind. I was betrayed by my own tongue. It learned to sing in other languages. This tongue is a stem in a vasculum or a flower blackened by soot. I left home before the fire, but I still blame the fire for my scars. To run around in circle is the easiest way to undo the burning. From here, it's difficult to tell what direction a bead rolls around a ring. To unmake the fire, I become too young for the dance floor. In my palms are the seeds saved from the fire. It is all I can will to my unborn children, even though what we own drown us with its weight. I find it hard to unclench my fist or stop to sing. So I think I was 9 years when we had the crisis, the religious crisis in Nigeria, and I thought about what happened before that. So my memory of like the place I was born often can like start at that point, and I always feel like what to know what comes before that. And in terms of like imagining a spiral situation, what I see is if I can like remember what happened up till until that moment, and then just recreate like things that came before to be like a perfect kind of like memory of like a whole childhood that I would have that will not just be about war and all that. And there are so many blames we just put on what happened, even though we would say I didn't lose anyone directly, like my family at that time, but like we lose friends, we moved houses, some friends that never returned to the city and all that. So I felt like Vast Concert is my way of bringing back those that I wish never left. So that's I think what gave birth to like Reverse Concert. And this series are also like in this poem, many of the part of the poems that I talk about ghosts or burying people this is not something that I made up. My father is an Arabic scholar, Islamic scholar, and it is a tradition of like the Muslims in Nigeria and also around the world. When people die, we don't like we bury our dead almost immediately, you know. And also my dad, as someone who's an Arabic scholar and in charge of the mosque who like inherited our grandfather, and all, he and his older uncle, my other uncles are like the ones in charge of this mosque and they take care of it. And when people die, Muslims, when they die, they bring them to the mosque. And then we like my father before me and like many of my uncles and cousins will be the ones in charge of this dead to like prepare the dead for like burial. You know what I mean? But my when I grew up, when I came of age, I would say my dad would then say, okay, you know, he's always thinking about death, and most times to be like, what if I die today? Who will take care of the dead when they bring them? You know what I mean? So most times my dad would then say, you have to be part of the people who take care of the dead, like prepare the dead for burial, such that you get used to the tradition and not be scared of like dead people. You know, see this as a ritual of like of respect for the people who were faithful in Islam. And every time it's like a continuous process. And I would say it never gets easier. Like when you're very close to a dead person, you prepare them for burial. When someone else die, you don't feel like, oh, now I'm very used to this. You never get used to seeing people die. You know what I mean? And that's what led to the poems about some of the burial rites and rituals that's contained in the poem. And this is one of them, titled "How to Pray for a Bird in Flight." My barber teaches me to talk to God. I fold my arms around my body to show how cold I stand in the jalabiya. I've had the same shadow for too long, and it does not hide me from the sun. The grave diggers lower another girl into the earth. We thank them again and we give sadaqah and label the grave plates in bold letters. My barber teaches me to pray for my dead sisters. They survived the war and the curfew but died months after in the labor room. I don't keep dates of my losses, even though my stomach is cold enough to preserve my griefs. I pray that a gazebo will not be made of my bones. The scar on my leg is evidence that I was born a cartographer. This is the closest I am to a bird and maybe to God. I think the reference to like girls in this situation was like um, there are people from where I come from where I grew up who don't believe that women should go to the hospital or be attended to by a male doctor, for example. And that situations in terms of like having to give birth or labor, they prefer to have like this kind of like manual birth giving process at home where they would ask people to pray and like women would just come like just ask for woman to push without any medical like experience. These are people that are very, some of them are experienced in terms of they've been doing it over time, but not like they have a like professional like degree, you know. And this is not to ridicule the experience of, you know, having to do something over and over until you become like an expert in it. But sometimes it leads to complications, and these are people who might not know. Some of them don't know what to do in terms of like um, postpartum problems. In those situations, we've like buried children, like also because there's a series of like young people getting married. There's a possibility of like people who recently got married or very young, and then when they have postpartum complications, there's no way to take care of it. Sometimes they die. And then when we go to bury those people, we still have because the people that take care of the burial ground, they don't get paid by anyone, you know. So it's like a communal contribution to keep the cemetery working. So that's like what inspired this poem, How to Pray for a Bird in Flight. The next one I would read is called Curfew, and it seemed to like be like I would say it encapsulates the whole feeling of the book, from the situations, from the language, from the pain, and the hope that I think that I imagine to be present in this work. And I will just read it. Curfew. Curfew. My body was colonized in a language of silence. Strands of my hair entrapped the ghost in the wind. They were not held prisoner, but the abrasions kept them warm or stuck. The sky was void of stars, or the smoke hid them from us. We became satellites to each other. Our shadows orbited our bodies from distance until they became entangled. We were planets of silences during the curfew. The stones and the fireplace were all we had to fill up our wounds. Instead, we let houseflies sing around the openings. Baba kept guard throughout those nights with life sharpened with grief. His body was a fireplace or a mosque full of ashes. We said our prayers silently. The soldiers slipped into the house and stained the wall with cement. All our children woke up with bloated stomachs. The wall was blue of a raging sea, threatening to wash out the whole town. We plucked out sponge from the tongues and scrubbed the house clean before we dressed our wounds with foreign flags. All we inherited from father was saved in an ambulance. The siren was muted, but its blue light flickered in the night. We got stuck on rods of bones. Now it's our turn to unpack the street, our turn to become the grave diggers. A dead tree grows from Baba's grave. We stand around it, but its shadow does not keep out the sunbite. After the curfew, we got served shy to heal the sores in our mouth. These scars are evidence that we mistake silence for peace. This poem happened to be my grandfather was buried in a cemetery in a place called Tudunwada in Kaduna, and because like I think he died in 1992. They're like a tea leaf that grew out of his, like, very close to his grave. So as Muslims, we also have this culture of grave visitation, because we believe that it helps you to think about death and, know to appreciate life. And at the time, my dad would visit this grave and then come back with the tea leaves. They like pluck the leaves and then make tea for us and all that. And every time we have that tea, there's always that belief that some part of my grandfather is nestling in our body as we do that, So there's this practice that we have, that I have personally, that is surrounding like the ritual of burying people and of the philosophy or psychology that goes into the constant visitation of this grave or burying new people, and the change that actually happened to the landscape. Like when you visit the graveyard maybe a week, by the time you're back in like 2 weeks, there's a whole lot of people who have died, or like different things that changed about the place. And this is like this consciousness that made me, that made up my kind of like my early childhood, and even up to this moment, I'm always thinking about that. There are also, as Muslim, we do this, what they call Ramadan fasting. When we do this fasting, before we start the fast, we often also visit the graveyard. So it's more like a yearly thing, where even if you forget about your dead, by the time it's a month of Ramadan, you have to go visit. So that's something that is very conscious about, that I'm very conscious about when I write poems. When I was writing this book, actually, because I feel like some of my other poems are like moving away from this, even though it's not like completely. I'm not sure I can be like off it completely, because it's like it's a continued process for me. This is a poem titled Aftermath. We dug the ground so many times, burying a dead body or sowing a seed, both of which did not grow. Our graves are colored as the seed from a lantern, gasping for fuel. My neighbor gave birth when silence was all that can be cherished. like clean water, gushing out of the rusty mouth of the tap. She was brave to have sealed the child's mouth when he was not suckling a nipple. Baba Mensa House Constitution. We must punctuate every 10 minutes with Ayatul Kursi for protection. It must be in whispers. This is not, this is how you know the people are tired of digging. Our Baba sits around the bonfire with the peacekeepers. Their hands cup their cheeks. The sun creeps upon our dark faces. Again, we excuse the intrusion. Mama tells us to dance when we can. It could be the last time we hear her sing. I think it's just a way of me reimagine this poem about like reimagining like hope, like an aftermath of what the violence that comes with the crisis and the curfew, and this is just like a way of like reenacting hope in myself and my belief of things to change, even though we pass through so many um, crises. How many more minutes I keep going?
Oh, we can stop whenever you're happy, or you can read a couple more if you want, because I'm really getting into the spiritual prayer like kind of feeling of your poems, getting lost in that, and the wonderful storytelling. It's brought up a number of things I'll ask you about in a little bit. So if you want to read like one or two more, then go for it.
Okay, I think I'll read two more poems. So I also, in a section of this poem, I have a section that has like satellite phone calls and also Wi-Fi, which is my way. You know, we used to have like poems, self-portrait, you know, and I was just thinking to myself, because I'm always in that habit of like thinking, like, how do I create um something that I know, but in a very different and in a very contemporary way. So I talked about self-portrait, but like, you know how self-portrait is sometimes like finding connections with a self with something that is outstanding sometimes. And I thought about how that can be achievable using the contemporary sense of connectivity. And I thought about Wi-Fi, you know, because that's the only reason I'm able to talk to you now, because of Wi-Fi. And I also think about, what if we are farther from, like if we are planets away, then that would be something like a satellite phone call. So I thought about the concept of Wi-Fi as a connecting tissue in place of what self-portrait would do. You know what I mean? So that's what I intend to achieve with the Wi-Fi and self-portrait. Even though like I think it's just two Wi-Fi poems that made it up here. I think I've had like up to like seven or 10 more Wi-Fi poems that I had. Some of that I'm not sure I can find some of them, but I also know that some were also published. So I had like Wi-Fi in the cemetery, Wi-Fi in prison yard, Wi-Fi in orphanage, Wi-Fi. I had like a couple of Wi-Fis, and also Wi-Fi in the mosque. You know, like things that I know to be very close to me, but in that situation that I'm writing about them, kind of like distant. So in that way, I just use Wi-Fi to bring that experience very close to me. So I'll be reading some satellite phone call poem, and this is about satellite phone call to the boys in the faulty Harmattan. When I was very young, my father has so many military friends and friends, I would say, and he wanted me to join the army at a time. I can't remember. I think I went for the exam and didn't do well, something like that, which I was very glad I didn't do well in. So no one picked me up. So, but I always, as someone who comes from like a not very affluent community, we used to have people join the army because it's a way of like earning respect. Even here in America, you know, I know like when people join the army, like when you're traveling, for example, you see that respect when people are like, okay, the veterans can come in first, you know, that respect that comes with being in the army or having served in the army is what prompted many people, young people especially, in Kakuri to join the army. And every time, or sometimes, like when I'm away, like now I'm in Cincinnati, when I go back to Nigeria and I was I was in Kaduna in January, like few weeks I would say ago. I was in Nigeria a few weeks ago, and anytime I'm like back, sometimes I get to hear about some of our friends, someone that I know, or someone like very younger than I am, like that they would just tell me they died, fighting the Boko Haram insurgents and some of those, and it always felt bad to always like hear that, and this led to a situation where I wrote about satellite phone call to the boys in a faulty ammo tank, as if to give hope. Even in despair, I'm trying to like chronicle hope, right? So boys in their early teens hold pictures of their mothers in sweaty palms. I should have been with them too, but they need someone here to pick up their calls when it seems God stopped checking the voicemail. Before the phone rang, I had my eyeballs in water, but they softened and splintered into fingerlings. I hear their voices asking me to make ablution. Today, I am a doctor in a ward full of dying hyacinths. I hear them sing, I bow before you and ask you to examine my heart today. I pray for the armor tank that should belong in the museum. I pray for the museum that should hold beautiful things except for war relics. I pray for all the relics that would have been prettier around the necks of a living soldier. I pray for the soldier that would have been a painter if there was no war that needed to be fought. I say these prayers aloud into the telephone until the line went back dead. I looked out the window. The sky was like old cotton fabric, soaked in a hot bath of cornflowers. The next one I'll read, maybe I will just read the Wi-Fi, one of the Wi-Fi poems. So the Wi-Fi poems, I have, I think, two of them. One is Wi-Fi in a cemetery, and I'll read I'll read the Wi-Fi in a prison yard. Wi-Fi in a prison yard. I tear up my heart into weeks of slivers, that I may remember how it all began. There was an eclipse, and I misplaced my eyes to the blood in the moon, a miscarriage of everything I own. I am sick of the nostalgia that comes with a stale memory for what I should have seen before the darkness. We find connections on the lines on our palms, and it becomes entangled into edible nest until a new inmate begins to cry. This globe is full of darkness, and only the lit places are burning. The fire punctured the ozone that blankets the burden in my ribcage. My heart is a week of cat's liver. It spins in a pool of grief. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. That was like a whole concert. I loved it. So, and I have a great deal to ask you about in a second. I'll just read a couple of things, like three very short things, but I think they kind of feed into the atmosphere that you created. So that's why these things I'll go with. And they're just at the end of my thing, Melody in Exile here.
Yeah.
But I had to write down some of the stuff that you said, because I want to come back to definitely one point you made. All right, so wander chaos. We quest in this world, following the roaring of the loud abysses, containing calamities we anticipate will simplify our pain. But these abysses contaminate our sorrows, deepening them bottomless. The mysteries of life, our abysses mask in insignificance. So these three shorter ones are kind of like I'll call them like little prelude poems to maybe some of the longer ones they frame around. So if that one seemed very short, that was kind of the atmosphere. Its goal is to just like lead you into the next thing. The end of the maze of time leads off the ledge of being. I want nothing. I am old. I want it all. I want back my Rambodian outburst, reveries that surprised, that seas envied. Oh, when the expression of my heart flowed as easily as the sea fiercely in the tumults of the chaos echoed waves. Now I'm an old man with a hollow heart, in an empty heart talked out. My love has lost its throat. The spring is closed. The well is boarded over. Which I think gets at a kind of a fear of no longer having the power that you had that maybe like carried you through life. In this case, like maybe the words abandoning you or poetry departing from you, we can say. Yeah. And then last one that closes the book, Lone Mountain, which is kind of one of the only ones that deals with explicitly a landscape around my house. The others are just sort of more imagined places, but this is one where there actually is a mountain outside my window over there called Lone Mountain because it's not, it might even be man-made. I don't remember the history, but it's just a little hill by itself, and we just call it Lone Mountain. The desert in the night is cold. The night has impulses all its own, and you obey them as you're told. When they haunt you with the sea you've never seen, you can hear the sea in the mountains. I'm an old man. I have wasted my life. Imagination mistook me for a god. I mistook myself for one. But I am timid. I am old. I have wasted my life. All right. So thank you. So Hussain, I had some questions, but you brought up a good thing that you brought up an idea for a question I wanted to get at.
Yeah. When
you were talking about your dad talking basically about this obligation to the dead and to the people, and to make yourself comfortable with that tradition as a duty. So I feel like poetry writing, but poetry in particular, we do that anyway. We acquaint ourselves with the dead, and we have a duty to the dead, whether that be the past dead from traditions that we come from, or are in conversation with, or are the contemporaries that we are writing kind of always sadly for, because we know that they'll leave us behind or we'll leave them behind, and we're writing for posterity for many reasons. So in that tradition, your book Soliloquy with the Ghost in Nile, so you're already communing with those dead. But how do you feel like as a poet you have accepted that responsibility of some obligation to the dead in your community, even though it's in a different vein from sort of what your father was talking about? Oh shoot, sorry, I think it paused here. Oh, there we go. Sorry, did it cut out on you?
Yeah, what's the question again? Sorry.
Sorry about that. So it was my Wi-Fi here, but even though you've gone down a different path than your father, and in your way of dealing with the dead and dealing with tradition, community, and all that, how do you still feel like, nonetheless, as a writer, you are still in a way paying homage to the dead in your respects and acquainting yourself with that? So do you still feel like that you're following that advice of your father of being comfortable around the dead and paying homage, even though you've sort of taken a different career route?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think this is not, it's a practice, a ritual that has nothing to do with like a change. The fact that I'm not there, it's more like I'm on break now. Anytime I go back home, I assume that responsibility, part of that ritual. And as a poet, I've always been like making reference like the dead, or talk about the living that you are no longer together with. So I felt like even that is not constant. There's a non-homogeneous concept of writing about the dead, or about what is there that is no longer there, or what we have now that maybe wasn't here before now. You understand? As the same concept of when you talk about like a mountain that you feel maybe it's even man-made, there's a possibility of you writing about your house or your environment with an imagination of like a century past. And you might write about that with no reference to the mountain, for example. So I felt like time can give you space. Time can buy you time. Oh, sorry, that sounds somehow like time can give you that space for you to rethink what used to be or what would be in the future. So I think that's how poetry is working. Sometimes we take a break for from like imaginative space. We move into other spaces, but we are still the same in between those channels. So like even now that I'm away from home, when I return any day, anytime, if there's a reason for me to take care of the dead, I'll surely be part of that ritual.
Oh, definitely. Thank you for that. So in the acknowledgments of your book, you talked about the generation of Nigerian poets that you feel grateful for
Yeah.
helping basically bring you up. And then in some of your talks about the poems that you read, you talked about the Muslim tradition. So
Yeah.
as a writer, how do you feel like these two traditions like helped you start go from maybe someone who wasn't writing to
Mm-hmm.
now a poet? So how do you kind of get your start?
Yeah, I think to start with, it is my Muslim or Islamic tradition that was the first thing that made me a poet, if I would say. Because like my grandparents and my uncles, I have cousins, my father, they all write poems in Arabic. And those like were the first poems that I learned to kind of like memorize up to this moment. For some reason, I don't know why, but it's very difficult for me to memorize English poems because of like the spiritual connotation that we imagine poetry to be, especially when they're in Arabic, to be as a form of prayer. It's easier for me to like memorize. And then I also come from a Sufi tradition. Sufi, so like a denomination of like Muslims who believe in like sanctifying the souls, you know, by all mediums. Um, so like we also have this habit of like reciting poems and all that. I used to be like a teacher. I teach like older women how to read Arabic and all that. So I felt like the tradition that is more the earliest tradition that I have of poetry is the Arabic or Islamic poems. I read Nasif al-Yaziji or Imam Ghazali or Imam Shafi'i. These are like people whose poems, ghazals or kafiyas that I read as a child. So I think in that regard, my dad is also part of like my dad and my whole extended family, are like I come from that long line of people writing other languages or Arabic precisely. And because I'm from Nigeria, and the people that we want to talk to about these poems are Yoruba, so there's a reason to translate from Arabic to Yoruba language. All right. And so like I think the earliest tradition that I have that influenced me is that Islamic or Muslim tradition. Also, I have in terms of the lineage of Nigerian poets that I paid homage to, there are some of them I've never met before. There are some of them that I've met. But one of the first few people that I think I've met in a very early age, like me writing poem, is Jumoke Varissimo. She's a poet and she's the author of I Am Memory. I was a time I was just like tired of being at home when I think I reached out to her on Twitter or something, like, hey, I want to like reach out to you because at that time she had published like 2 collections. I just want to like sit down with her to have a discussion about poems and poetry, and then just to like reenact my hope in this path that I want to take. And she was very generous with knowledge and also like I remember she bought lunch for me, that day. And also there are people who we do not know now in the Western world. Um, some of them we meet at on Sundays in some places in Kaduna. It's called like a Heart of Arts for Silver, where we just come together and recite poems. People like Sadiq Zukogi, the author of Your Creed, My Kibla, is also part of the people who used to be together. So we're friends, and he's always been part of that community too, like people that I share with. And aside that group, I also have Sadiq, also like one of those individuals that I recite my poems to. Sometimes he reads his own manuscript to me. Sometimes we hang out over dinner or lunch to talk about poems. So like the tradition that I talk about is not necessarily the older tradition, like poets, they're often like the young contemporary poets that I know, like also some of them that I read online. But for the fact that I can come online and read someone or pick up a journal and read a Nigerian whose language or like the pattern of how they write, I understand, kind of like gives me hope to keep writing. You know, there are, I'm not really, I wouldn't say there are old poets that have inspired me. I've picked up like, there are days when I went to like the library and pick up books by maybe old penguin anthologies and all that for Africans. And I've read a whole lot of African poets, some of them that I cannot remember, but like very common ones like Christopher Okibo. These are like people that they're like popular, or like Wole Soyinka or Chinua Achebe. These are like popular writers in general, not just poets, who I would say influenced me in different forms. But to be very frank, it's the Islamic or Muslim traditional poets, and the contemporary Nigerian poets that I think influenced me so much.
Yeah, I'm glad you kind of took that to the contemporary Nigerian poets, because that's what I wanted to ask out here. Because for people who maybe aren't on Twitter or as like ingrained in the literary Twitter circle, they might not have an understanding of just how prolific the Nigerian poetry community is, and how much great writing is coming out of Nigeria, or out of poets who are from Nigeria but are now like in these prestigious MFAs around the country, and editors of journals and everything. So what really is like and you're one of the major forerunners now of the contemporary Nigerian poetry tradition, helping, kind of define what that tradition is to come and that people are responding to and everything. So what is like poetry in Nigeria? How essential is it to the people? How important as a community like Thai? And then what do you really think about or I'll say like, how pleased are you, or what are some thoughts on the contemporary Nigerian tradition right now?
Yeah, it's just like a new thing. I would say not very new, but like there's like categories of poetry, if you want to go traditional, with how poetry is defined in the Nigerian scene. And this is like for like centuries. We have, for example, I'm very conversant with, say, Yoruba and Hausa, which are like two languages, one of the biggest languages widely spoken in Nigeria. Yoruba, they have what they call Oniaro, which is like, I think, elegy, you would call it. Like when people die, there are people who come like recite poems for the people who are grieving or the bereaved. They have Oni Yawo, which is like a song or like a kind of like series of poems that you recite when people are going to getting married. We have Oriki. Oriki is like it's like a praise for the day you were born, in a way where like everything that surrounds your birth would be made into a poem. So like in terms of looking at it traditionally, there's a long tradition of poetry in Nigeria. You know what I mean? In the Hausa tradition, I know they call waka, I think it's like the general term for it. But like there are also series of people who talk about politics, Nigerian politics, African politics, talk about the environment in their poems, So all those people are like, these are like unique generations, like writers and poets. But recently we've had an upsurge of like people coming to the West. And the reason for that is things are changing, having to come to like, say, the MFA would kind of like open you up to like meet with other people that are not necessarily traditionally from your own line of understanding what a poem is. So we've had poets who include like Yoruba in their works. We had those people might not be the ones you see in MFA. Most of us that you see in MFAs are the people who write in English. People who write in Hausa, who write in Igbo. There are people who write in Ibibio, or Tiv. These are not people, because the audience is not here, And this is like one of the, I would say, like failure of like translation. So if translation was like a medium that is as supported as it should be, you would have known many more of them. But I had like a Nigerian poet called Zach Malik. It's also like he's into this chant. He does chants, like you recite a whole like pages or hours of poems in Yoruba. And he's also having his PhD now at the University of Nebraska. But he is here because he wants to write solely in English. But for people who are not writing in English, I think there are still like thousands of them in Nigeria. And some of all these people influenced even the music that comes out of Nigeria.
Oh, that's incredible. Scene and everything, and yeah, I read a lot of the people on Twitter because their poems are getting published in all these places, and they fortunately post them online because I don't subscribe to all the journals, so I can't read them all in print, but I get to read them online, and they're all very moving. Yeah. So that reminds me of the languages. Do you yourself ever write poems in other languages and then like maybe like translate them to English or translate some of your English poems to other languages?
There are poems that I've written before. There's a poem, I think two poems of mine that are published in the Poetry Magazine translation issue, which I started half of the poem. I started one of the poem. I actually want to write a Yoruba poem. So I used to have a journal where like I include lines that are that I feel are very like cool, and nice to be in a poem. And in that diary, the other day, I just thought about a line in Yoruba, which I felt would be a good Yoruba line in a poem. And then when I wrote that, so for some reason, I just continued writing lines and lines and lines. And I think I wrote like 16 or 17 lines. I was like, well, this is enough, So I just went back into that diary and I checked for the other ones, the Yoruba lines that I had saved, and I made it into another poem, which I translated into English. But sometimes, how translation is not necessarily, it's not transliteration as people would imagine it. It's like sometimes it's transmission. So some of the poems that are in Yoruba were then transmitted into English, or sometimes it is the English that I use to say, okay, now, if this should be in English, the Yoruba version is not right. You know what I mean? So I am someone, I've written in Yoruba before and also published in Yoruba, and I want to continue doing that. And also I translate a poet, Nigerian Yoruba poet called Debo Awe. He solely writes in Yoruba, and I translated one of his poems that was, I think, published with the Cortland Review. It's called Papanjo. That's like the title of the poem. So I'm also into translating Yoruba poem into English.
Awesome. About your own craft, because you mentioned kind of your process there, that you had this journal and everything. So what I love about your collection is the real experimentation of a lot of the forms, because they vary so much throughout the book. You have so many different looks to your poems where you can open to any page, just flip through the book, and you're struck by just how different the forms are from each other. So how in your own writing, like how important is like experimenting with form and look and everything and different styles in trying to get at the heart of these issues that you're exploring, or trying to like frame the question or frame the experience, right?
Yeah. For me, I think form is subjected to the theme sometimes, because there are times, or like depends on how fast I write the poem. There are poems that come to me in like bits by bits. So there's a possibility that I will write them in those beats, sometimes rearranged. But oftentimes I read poems aloud to myself in my room, and sometimes it's just like, this is not. If I cannot read it aloud that way, I feel like there should be a space here. So sometimes it's controlled by how I read, is how I control my line breaks, or like in that influence the form. So like ideally, it depends on the theme. Sometimes because there are poems that I write on like a sit, like just by sitting down, it just come to me fully made. In those situations, I don't know what I don't really say this is what I want for my forms, but it can influence it to be in couplets, which is like the most convenient form for me. So if I write in couplets, it's easier for me to do couplets than other forms, like say sonnet or something like that. I'm not sure I can really, really like do sonnet. But that's not to say I would never do it. But like other forms such as like abecedarians, which I have to do maybe like, because these are letter words. That situations they guide you to how you write them. I can do that. So writing in terms of forms is always dependent on the theme or how fast I write the poem. So I don't necessarily sit down to say, okay, this is the form I want for a poem before I start to write.
Okay, yeah. So it's a lot more organic for you.
Yeah.
So I could talk to you forever because I love like your perspective on poetry, but I'll aim to get you out of here on this question, which is an annoying question, I know, but I think that you'll have a really good answer for it. So that's why I'll ask it. So it's one I never typically ask. But you mentioned Sufism and
Yeah.
that making everything enriching for the soul as kind of the purpose and everything. So for you,
Mhm.
what is not like to define poetry, but what for you is poetry that makes it, or like what are you looking for in poetry? What makes it so spiritually enriching for you, and how do you use poetry to kind of enrich yourself, like you mentioned?
Yeah, I still believe that poetry for me it's prayer. There was a time I think I thought about it's like it's both prayer and a lifeline for me. You know, my poems sometimes when I engage with people about a poem, I feel like I'm recreating the lives of people who had passed that I talked about, or it's like giving credit to um, the hopefulness that exists in people who, in the face of all forms of violence, choose to speak out. So that practice is what I think keeps me going. And my definition of poetry is prayer and lifeline. And that's exactly what I always have. And my next, actually, coincidentally, I thought about that. And it was the first thing that I wrote in my new manuscript, which is poetry is prayer and a lifeline. So that's how I always see my poems. Poetry sometimes is an incantation, which is where I come from. That itself is a spiritual practice. Poetry is saying amen at the end of the last line, which is how you would expect in a prayer house. Poetry is history. Poetry is psychological, and it helps me feel best. It also like helps my mental health. Sometimes when I'm stressed out and I just read few poems, I just like, oh, I start to think about what makes up those poems, what direction the poem could have gone. Why did it choose this path? Those questioning are like things that I believe are important to me when I talk, read, or discuss poetry. So poetry is life, prayer, and a lifeline.
Awesome. That's beautiful. And I'm glad you mentioned a project that you're working on, because I was hoping that there definitely is one, because I'll read basically everything that your name's on. And hopefully we can talk again when that project is out and everything and have you back. So
Absolutely.
Hussain, thank you so much for joining me on
Thank
this
you so much, Shane.
and I'll talk to you here in a little bit then outside of this.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
All right.